Imagine this. You're on the phone with your two little girls, hearing their sweet voices, their innocent laughter, and suddenly that laughter fades into fear. A trembling voice breaks the silence. "No, Daddy, please don't." Then in an instant the sound of gunshots pierces the air, followed by a chilling silence that no parent should ever have to endure. This isn't a movie scene, nor did a twisted piece of fiction. It's a real event that unfolded in Dallas, Texas, when a man named John David Battaglia committed one of the most unthinkable acts in American crime history. A father, once charming, intelligent, and respected, turned his rage and obsession for control into an act of unimaginable evil. He murdered his two young daughters, Faith and Liberty, while their mother listened helplessly on the other end of the phone, forced to hear her babies take their final breaths. What drove a father to such darkness? How does a man who once claimed to love his children turn into the very monster that destroyed them? This case isn't just about murder, it's about manipulation, revenge, and the terrifying depth of human cruelty. As we unravel this story, you'll hear about the warning signs everyone missed, the chilling calmness he displayed after the killings, and the haunting smile he wore in court. This is the tragic and horrifying story of John David Battaglia. Before the world came to know him as a cold-blooded murderer, John David Battaglia Jr. was, on the surface, the picture of success: intelligent, well-spoken, and sharply dressed. Born on August 2, 1955 in Enterprise, Alabama, he was the son of a U.S. military family, raised with strict discipline and constant relocations. Those who knew him in childhood often described him as bright, polite, and extremely confident, maybe even a little too confident. His charm was undeniable, and from a young age he learned how to use that charm to control situations and people around him. Growing up in a military household shaped John's personality in very specific ways. He learned to project authority, to demand respect, and to maintain a perfect exterior no matter what chaos brewed underneath. Friends from his youth recalled that John could switch from pleasant to furious in an instant, a temper that appeared without warning, then vanished as quickly as it came, leaving everyone else confused and intimidated. It was a pattern that would follow him for the rest of his life. As an adult, Battaglia appeared to have everything together. He pursued higher education, built a respectable career, and became an accountant and software engineer. He dressed sharply, spoke with confidence, and carried himself like a man who had life figured out. To his colleagues and acquaintances, he was intelligent, witty, and charismatic. He knew how to make people like him, how to appear polished and professional. But behind that calm exterior lay a man with deep insecurities and a need for absolute control. His first marriage revealed the earliest cracks in that polished image. He married young and had a daughter, Christy, whom he adored. But beneath the surface of family life, the anger that John kept so tightly hidden began to show. He was controlling, prone to explosive arguments, and manipulative. When that marriage ended in divorce, it was bitter, filled with accusations and emotional manipulation. Christy's mother described him as charming but terrifying, a man who could turn affection into aggression in seconds. After the divorce, Battaglia reinvented himself once again. He moved to Dallas, Texas and started over, presenting himself as the perfect Southern gentleman. And that's where he met Jean Pearle, a vibrant woman who was drawn to his intelligence and confidence. At first, John seemed like a dream come true, attentive, articulate, funny, and deeply devoted. Jean would later say that when she met him, she thought she'd finally found stability, a man who would cherish her and build a future with her. The two married and had two beautiful daughters, Faith and Liberty. Their names alone carried hope, symbols of a new beginning, of a family that could finally bring peace to John's restless life. Friends described Battaglia as a proud father, constantly showing off photos of his little girls. To outsiders, they looked like a picture-perfect family, two smiling daughters, a beautiful home, and a successful father who doted on them. But behind closed doors, Jean soon began to see another side of John, the same volatile temper that had destroyed his first marriage. Small arguments turned into threats, and moments of charm were followed by terrifying outbursts of rage. He became possessive, jealous, and verbally abusive. She described walking on eggshells, never knowing what might set him off next. By the late 1990s, what began as a picture-perfect marriage between John Battaglia and Jean Pearle had turned into a relationship defined by fear, anger, and control. Jean, once charmed by John's intelligence and humor, now saw the same traits as part of a darker pattern: manipulation, condescension, and emotional cruelty. The man who once brought her flowers now hurled insults. The man who once promised her stability now made her feel like a prisoner inside her own home. Battaglia's temper had grown unpredictable. It could flare up over the smallest things, a misplaced item, a perceived slight, or even something as innocent as a disagreement about parenting. In one moment he could be affectionate and apologetic, and in the next he would erupt into rage, hurling words meant to cut deep. He wanted control, absolute control, not just over his household but over the emotions of everyone in it. For years Mary Jean endured it. She tried to protect her daughters from the worst of it, hoping things might change, that maybe he would go back to being the man she first met. But John's anger was not fading, it was escalating. Eventually, the emotional abuse turned physical. One confrontation went too far, and Battaglia was arrested for assaulting Mary Jean. That arrest became a turning point. For Mary Jean, it was no longer about saving a marriage, it was about saving herself and her daughters. The court issued a restraining order, forcing John to stay away from her. But he wasn't the type of man to follow rules. He saw the order not as a boundary but as a challenge. In his mind, Mary Jean was defying him, and he couldn't stand that. He began to use the only leverage he had left, their daughters, Faith and Liberty. Faith, at 9 years old, was a thoughtful, gentle soul who adored her father but understood more than most children her age. Liberty, only 6, was energetic, playful, and innocent. She saw the world through wide, trusting eyes. Both girls loved their parents deeply and wanted them to get along. They didn't understand why their father's visits always left their mothers so tense, or why their mother would cry after hanging up the phone with him. Even after the restraining order, John continued to call, sometimes pretending everything was fine, other times launching into bitter tirades. He could switch between affection and anger in the blink of an eye, a psychological tactic that kept Mary Jean constantly off balance. He used the girls as emotional messengers, asking them to tell their mother how much he missed her, or worse, accusing Mary Jean of keeping him away from his own children. Behind those words was something more sinister, a man who refused to lose control. He saw Mary Jean's independence as betrayal and the court's protection as humiliation. A custody battle began brewing between them, stretching over months. Each court appearance was a reminder to John that he was losing, not just his wife but his image, his authority, his dominance. For a man like Battaglia, that loss of control was unbearable. He began to portray himself as the victim, charming social workers, smiling through interviews and claiming Mary Jean exaggerated everything. To outsiders he appeared calm, intelligent, even wounded. But Mary Jean knew the truth. The moment the cameras were off, his mask slipped. In private he sent messages laced with sarcasm and veiled threats, showing her that he was still watching. Mary Jean confided in friends and authorities that she feared for her safety, that her ex-husband's behavior was becoming increasingly erratic. She told one friend, "I think he's dangerous. I really do." The tension between them became unbearable. Mary Jean did everything she could to shield Faith and Liberty from it, trying to preserve some sense of normalcy, school drop-offs, dance classes, family outings. But even the girls began to sense the growing divide. Faith often tried to comfort her mother after phone calls with her father. Liberty, too young to understand, would draw pictures of all three of them smiling together. Innocent hope from a child who only wanted peace. What Mary Jean didn't know was that, beneath John's polished exterior and charming voice, his resentment was festering. He blamed her for his arrest, for his humiliation in court, and for taking away what he believed was rightfully his, control over his family. And as the custody battle intensified, that resentment evolved into something darker, something dangerous. The stage was set for a tragedy no one could have imagined. Because for John Battaglia, if he couldn't control his family in life, he would control their story in death. It was the evening of May 2, 2001 in Dallas, Texas, a calm spring night that should have been like any other. 9-year-old Faith and 6-year-old Liberty Battaglia were spending the evening with their father, John Battaglia, at his apartment on Spring Valley Road, just as the court had allowed. To their mother, Mary Jean Pearle, this visit was routine, though she never fully shook off the fear that came whenever John had the girls alone. Around 7:30 p.m., Mary Jean received a call from John. His voice smooth, almost cheerful. He told her the girls wanted to say goodnight. She could hear them in the background, their small voices familiar and sweet. Faith picked up the phone and said, "Mommy, why do you want Daddy to go to jail?" That question pierced through her mother's heart, because Mary Jean instantly recognized it wasn't her daughter's voice speaking, it was John's manipulation. Mary Jean tried to stay calm, asking softly to speak directly with John. But before she could say more, Faith's trembling voice came through again, this time terrified. "No, Daddy, please don't do it." Then a series of gunshots echoed through the phone line. Mary Jean froze, screaming Faith's name, her voice breaking through tears. But all she could hear was silence, and then the phone went dead. Panicked and trembling, she dialed 911, telling the operator that her ex-husband had just shot their daughters while she was on the phone with them. Police were immediately dispatched to Battaglia's apartment. When officers arrived, they were met with a horrifying scene. Inside, the walls were lined with family photos, drawings, and framed memories of two smiling girls, a home that looked warm, loving, and ordinary. But in the midst of that, tragedy lay in silence. Faith and Liberty were both found shot to death, each struck multiple times by their father's .45 caliber revolver. Their tiny bodies were discovered near the phone, as if they had tried to call for help. The crime scene told a story of pure betrayal, a father who had turned his love into a weapon. Battaglia had already fled. As investigators began their search, he called a friend later that night, sounding calm, almost satisfied. In the days that followed, he went to a tattoo parlor and had 2 red roses inked onto his upper arm. One for Faith, one for Liberty. To many, it was the final sign of his twisted perception of love and ownership. The next day, John Battaglia was arrested in downtown Dallas, smiling as officers took him into custody, a chilling grin that would become the image burned into the public's memory. In 2002, inside the tense courtroom of Dallas County, John David Battaglia finally faced justice for the unthinkable, the murders of his 2 daughters, Faith and Liberty. The atmosphere was heavy, the silence almost suffocating as prosecutors described the crime in chilling detail. They called it an act of ultimate revenge, a father's calculated decision to destroy what his ex-wife loved most, just to make her suffer. The jurors listened, horrified, as they heard how Battaglia lured his daughters into his apartment, called Mary Jean, and forced her to hear their final moments. The prosecution painted a picture of a man who thrived on control and cruelty. They said he wasn't insane, he was deliberate. Every move, every word, was designed to inflict maximum emotional pain. On the other hand, the defense argued that Battaglia suffered from bipolar disorder and delusions, claiming he wasn't fully aware of his actions. But as the trial went on, their argument grew weaker. Battaglia showed little sign of remorse. Instead, he appeared disturbingly calm, even smiling at times, as the court was shown photographs of Faith and Liberty's lifeless bodies. That haunting smile became the symbol of his arrogance and detachment, sparking public outrage far beyond Dallas. The community, the media, and even jurors were deeply shaken by his composure. When the jury finally delivered their verdict, guilty of capital murder, the courtroom erupted in an emotional wave of relief and sorrow. The judge sentenced him to death by lethal injection, marking the end of a trial that had exposed both unimaginable evil and a mother's enduring pain. As she stood to address the man who had taken everything from her, Mary Jean Pearle's voice quivered but did not break. She looked directly at Battaglia and said, "You are a sociopath, John. You wanted to hurt me and you succeeded." Her words cut through the courtroom like a blade, the final truth spoken to a man who had chosen hatred over love. After his conviction, John David Battaglia was transferred to the Allen B. Polunsky Unit in Livingston, Texas, home to the state's most notorious death row inmates. Behind the cold concrete walls and razor wire fences, Battaglia continued to project the same arrogance that had defined him throughout his life. While most inmates spent their days in quiet reflection or despair, John spent his plotting, filing one appeal after another, arguing that he was mentally incompetent to be executed. From his small, isolated cell, Battaglia maintained the same manipulative charm he'd used in the outside world. He wrote letters filled with delusion and denial, claiming he was the victim of a government conspiracy, insisting that the justice system had twisted his words and fabricated evidence. Psychologists were brought in to evaluate him several times, and their reports painted a disturbing picture. Battaglia appeared calm, intelligent, and articulate, but beneath that composed exterior was a man entirely devoid of empathy. In court documents, he chillingly referred to the murders of Faith and Liberty as mere events, a word that revealed the depth of his emotional detachment. He spoke about the tragedy as if it were an unfortunate misunderstanding rather than an act of calculated evil. These statements, along with his refusal to express remorse, further fueled public anger and disbelief. In 2016, just hours before his scheduled execution, a federal appeals court issued a last-minute stay of execution, ordering a mental competency review. Psychiatrists once again examined him, trying to determine if he truly understood why he was being put to death. But after a long legal battle, the Texas Court of Criminal Appeals ruled in 2017 that Battaglia was fully competent, that he knew exactly what he had done, and exactly why he was being punished. With that decision, the date was set, February 1, 2018. The countdown to his final day began, and with every passing moment, the world waited to see how this once charming, manipulative man would face the ultimate consequence of his own cruelty. On February 1, 2018, inside the Huntsville Unit, Texas' oldest and most infamous prison, John David Battaglia awoke to his final sunrise. The man who once called himself charming and intelligent was now simply inmate number 9999486, spending his last hours in a sterile holding cell just steps away from the death chamber. As the day unfolded, there was no visible fear in his eyes, only the same unnerving calmness that had defined him throughout his years on death row. For his last meal, Battaglia made no special request. He was served the standard TDCJ plate, chicken fried steak, mashed potatoes with country gravy and a side of vegetables. He ate quietly, alone, showing no emotion, no sign of reflection, as if the weight of his crimes had never existed. Outside the prison, protesters and reporters gathered, while inside, Jean Pearle, the woman who had lost everything because of him, prepared herself to witness the man who destroyed her life take his final breath. At 9:30 p.m., guards led Battaglia from his cell to the execution chamber, his hands cuffed and shackled. He lay down on the gurney as the straps were fastened across his arms and chest. When the curtain opened, revealing the witnesses, he turned his head toward the glass with that familiar, haunting smirk. His gaze found Mary Jean, seated silently among the observers. And then, with a voice steady and almost casual, he said, "Well, hi Mary Jean. See y'all later. Go ahead, please." It was as if he were greeting an old friend, not facing justice for murdering his two daughters. The room fell still. Moments later, the lethal injection began to flow. His breathing slowed, his body relaxed, and yet, disturbingly, a faint smile lingered on his face, the same cold smile he'd worn during his trial. At 9:40 p.m., John David Battaglia was pronounced dead at the Huntsville Unit in Texas. Outside, the night air hung heavy with silence, a silence that seemed to carry the echoes of faith and liberty's voices, and a mother's heartbreak that could never truly fade. As the screen fades to black and the echoes of this haunting story linger, we're left with one undeniable truth: evil can sometimes wear the face of charm, intelligence, and confidence. John David Battaglia wasn't a stranger or a shadow in the dark. He was a father, a husband, and a man who chose revenge over love. Now I want to hear from you. Do you believe justice was truly served in this case? Was Battaglia's calmness a sign of true insanity, or pure, calculated evil? Share your thoughts in the comments below. Your perspective matters. Every opinion adds another layer to understanding how something like this could ever happen within the walls of a family home. And if you want more real, in-depth true crime stories like this one, don't forget to like, subscribe, and turn on the notification bell so you never miss an episode.